Welcome to the Codcast from CommonWealth Magazine. I'm Michael Jonas. It's still nearly 2 years off, but Massachusetts will have an election for governor in November of next year. At this early stage, there is exactly one declared candidate in the race, former Democratic State Senator Ben Downing, and he is here this week on the Codcast. Hey there, Ben. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Appreciate it.
So, I was thinking, getting ready for this about that. There's this Thomas Jefferson line where he called the presidency a splendid misery. And I kind of couldn't help but think that, Charlie Baker might be saying the same thing today. So why do you want this job?
Because I think the potential of Massachusetts is limitless. And I think what we've been missing is leadership with a sense of urgency that taps into that potential to solve the big problems facing us. And yes, that'll be tough work. It is not easy. There is a reason that issues like climate change, transportation finance, universal childcare, why they haven't been addressed. But we have the potential at our fingertips, and that's why I'm running, to try to tap into that potential to help communities like those I've grown up in, Pittsfield, East Boston, and so many others just like them.
And you, in your announcement, said we need to build a community and an economy that works for everyone. What do you mean by that? And have we fallen short in that?
Yeah, I think there are any number of statistics that would show us that economic inequality, that wealth gaps have not only persisted in Massachusetts, but have grown wider and wider. And those gaps are, from one end of the economic spectrum to the other. There are racial wealth gaps that the Boston Fed in particular in Suffolk County has documented, right? The gap from $247,000 is the median wealth of a white family to $8 for an African-American family. And then there are regional inequities, right? In the rate of growth and the strength of the economies in Pittsfield and our other gateway cities in the surrounding communities. And then here in Greater Boston, right? Significantly different universes. If my mother's home in Pittsfield were put on the market in Boston 2.5 hours east, it would get 3 times what she'll probably get for it in Pittsfield if she ever sells it. All within a state that's effectively the size of Silicon Valley. So I think we can build a much fairer, stronger Massachusetts where there is a greater shared opportunity, certainly a fairer economy that shares more wealth by investing in those communities and by taking on some of those big problems we talked about.
So those of us who've sort of been in and around Beacon Hill for a while certainly know you well and know your history and your record, but I'm sure for a lot of folks you're not as familiar. So just help us understand a little bit, understand Ben Downing a little bit better. One thing I'd love to ask about. So you're 39, if my crack research is accurate, but you were elected to the state senate at age 25, which is pretty remarkable. And the other thing that sort of struck me, I think that's the exact same age that Jane Swift was elected to the exact same seat, representing the far western part of the state. So what's it about? What's that about out there?
Well, first, maybe to draw another connection, right? I had Jane Swift's mom as a teacher in high school. Jane Swift was and remains one of the kindest people I've ever met in my life. My dad was running for district attorney in 1990 when Jane was running for the state senate, and there were more than a few occasions where we were all holding signs outside of the same polling places. And beyond my admiration for Jane Swift and our beyond any political differences, she will always be the candidate that had the best donuts at those standouts, including the notorious Bavarian cream donut that Dunkin' Donuts no longer has for some reason. But I don't know. I think the Berkshires, we've seen a lot of young people leave Pittsfield and North Adams, mine and Jane's hometowns.
Right.
And I think, there is an openness when young people come back and when they have something to offer, when they're able to outline the challenges that they think would help bring more of their classmates and their generation back. There's an openness to that, a willingness to give a young person a chance. And so, I ran in 2006, and it was by no means a plan, right? I was in grad school at Tufts. I had a nice internship lined up that I was working, and the state Senate seat opened up, and I was talking myself out of running for that seat when I was on the phone with my younger brother, and he literally hung up on me. Like, I didn't know it. I thought the phone dropped. I called him back and said, "Hey, sorry, I have bad coverage." And he said, "No, you're being an idiot. You've got this great opportunity. This is the community that gave us every opportunity in life. Go out there and talk to people about how you want to try to make it so that more of us can go back, and it can be the Pittsfield, the Berkshires, the Western Mass we all know it can be."
And maybe tell us a little, since you mentioned it, more about your family. And I know in your kickoff video, you talked about losing both your dad and one of your brothers to heart disease suddenly. Obviously, your brother at a very young age, and your dad was still a young man himself. And you sort of talked about how that's shaped you. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things, just generally, Michael, right? Like it both of those losses, and I think, all loss is unique and painful regardless of the time and the circumstances, and too many people have had to deal with that over this last year. For me, the impact was to deepen my empathy, right? It was, I'm someone who, I knew how lucky I was growing up, but I don't think I fully appreciated it until I lost my dad, when he passed in 2003. And that became a connection point for me when I would meet people in my life and then later on the campaign trail and in the Senate who were dealing with loss themselves, right? And oftentimes loss that was completely different, but it was still that same pain, that's still that same hole in your life. Practically, I don't know if I ever would have run for the state Senate if my father was still alive.
Is that right?
It's not that I would have wanted to give back to my community in some way. But one of the reasons I was able to muster the confidence to run, was that one of the first public speeches I ever had to give was my father's eulogy. And when, you've stood in front of a church of your family and friends when your whole world is shattered, and you can get through that, then speaking to a local Democratic town committee, to a neighborhood association, to a big crowd, isn't all that daunting anymore. And it also, that experience, we had people show up at our house for days and during the services and after, just to check on us, to drop off the 17th platter of deli meats and cheeses that we didn't need, but that was the only thing they knew how to do. Literally, the folks at Samuel's Deli had to start rejecting orders, and we just started making donations to the Christian Center in Pittsfield. That community was always there for us, and yet that's the same community that people told me growing up had nothing to offer us, that we ought to study hard and get away from it. And that was part of the reason I wanted to run, because I looked at those people who were there for us, who lined the streets for my dad, and said they deserve better than to be written off. And I know that's true of communities like Pittsfield across Massachusetts. So those experiences, they just deepen that resolve and that desire to give back. And, in particular with Nate's loss, right? Nate was my best friend. We became incredibly close after my dad passed. I mean, we both went to Providence College. We had a lot of these similar experiences. Like I said, he pushed me into the Senate race in some ways. He then went and got an internship at the Supreme Court and did nothing to help the campaign other than nitpick it from 9 hours away, which he would vouch for if he were still here with us. Nate, losing my dad deepened my empathy. For Nate, it was that sense of urgency, right? Nate had every gift that I've been given and so much more. Just incredibly talented, better writer, smarter, you name it. I could go through all of it. But I got a gift that he didn't get, which is time on this earth, years. And I came away from that experience, even more impatient and certainly more urgent, and less tolerant of the idea that we can just put off trying to do good work, put off trying to solve big problems to the next year, to the next session, to the next decade, right? Which too often is what happens in Massachusetts.
And the way you sort of describe the impact of that loss, it's powerful. I'm sure people have said it to you. You can't help at this moment but sort of think about sort of the echoes of what we've heard about President Biden's experience with that, and how he's I guess tried to channel that incredible pain and loss and sort of help it to kind of fuel his kind of continued efforts to press forward. I mean, most recently with the loss of his son, he's talked about how it was easy to think about just curling up and saying you're done, and that he's kind of tried to instead sort of use that grief sort of, in a way to sort of move ahead. It sounds similar. And again, I'm sure this is nothing unique. I'm sure you guys are just have the platform to share publicly kind of how loss and grief get processed and channeled by everyone. It's a universal experience we all go through.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, we've had examples in our lives, right? Like for me, my grandmother, we grew up one street over from my grandmother. My grandfather passed away when about a year and a half, not long after the youngest of the ninth in their family was born, right? And, my grandmother, 44 years old, 9 kids in the house.
Wow.
She was a secretary at the Catholic schools of Pittsfield, secretary in the guidance department. And she held that family together, right? And I had, the older uncles came back, left school, took jobs, and that family rallied around one another, right? And they had their ups and downs. But I still have this vivid memory of seeing my grandmother at my dad's funeral, right? And she's holding, a Downing for District Attorney button. Every once in a while sort of winking at me when she had, shook hands and given a hug to someone that she might not have otherwise shook hands and given a hug to, right? And when you can get through loss like that and smile and come out at the other side, then I think it gives you a little bit of something in your backbone, but it also gives you a soft spot that you know what it is to struggle, what that pain and that loss is. And it gives you a place to connect with people, right? And I think we lose a lot of that in our world these days, and I think it's important to retain that and hold on to that. And it's something I've tried to hold on to. It's I want to honor my dad and my brother's memory with the life that I lead, and that is a constant challenge for me every day. But it's a high bar that I want to strive for.
And you've mentioned your father and talked about buttons for him. He was the district attorney in Berkshire County at the time he died. He was in his 50s. Am I right when he died?
Yeah. He was district attorney for 13 years. That was my first real big political experience, right? In 1990 when he ran, going out. I was the oldest. I was 9 years old, going out, holding signs with him. I thought politics was getting to eat pizza and pancakes and, go to fairs, like you name it. Like it was great. But I also, I was old enough to appreciate moments when I would see people come up to my dad and talk to him about their concerns, about their fears, but also their hopes and their dreams for what they thought the community should be. And then just, his model of leadership beyond, the big trials that he had. My dad coached youth basketball at the Catholic Youth Center every Saturday morning, right? 5 and 6 year olds, in a noisy gym with kids who are running back and forth and sometimes shooting at the wrong hoop, right? And, he's there Friday night trying to write out the rotation to make sure that every kid gets a chance to play, gets a chance to carry the ball up. And it wasn't just because, that was sort of a zen time for him. He could be out there on the court with kids, but it was also to show them, like, there's a leader in this community that cares about you. And a lot of those kids who were playing on those teams had parents my dad would see during the week, right? And his example is a powerful one to this day, in his career and the type of dad he was. It's what I aim to be.
And that certainly his influence is what got you kind of bitten with the political bug, it sounds like, early on. And you even not only elected at 25, but even before that, you'd already worked several years for members of the state's congressional delegation. So it sounds like you were sort of on a political track early on.
So I would just want to say that because it's funny. It looks like a straight line on paper. Like I thought I was going to law school, right? Providence College, I'm going to go to law school. I applied to law schools, and everyone but one of the law schools I applied to didn't think I was ready to go to law school right away. And
no, they thought you'd do better at other things.
Yeah. I needed that spin in the summer of 2003, Michael.
Oh, I bet.
And I got into Suffolk. Suffolk is where my dad went, and that was my, like, I went to Providence where my dad went, not by design. It's just where I landed. I got into Suffolk where he went, and I just wasn't going to go. And now I didn't have a plan. I was mowing lawns at Tanglewood and thinking a lot, which is good because there's a lot of lawns to mow, so a lot of time to think.
Yeah.
And I lucked out. My college roommate was moving to D.C., and he was moving to D.C. to go to grad school at GW. And I went there just to get out of Pittsfield. I knew I had to do something else. And so it wasn't a plan to go to work on Capitol Hill. That's just kind of where I landed. So I share that just because in particular, when I talk to interns at the State House and stuff, I'm like, don't think there's a straight line here, right? Like it's you're going to go through some ups and downs, and you'll learn from
And it sounds like, I mean, you said your dad coached, CYO basketball. Was that also kind of a pillar or a strong part of your upbringing, the church and your Catholic faith, and even Providence College, the Catholic school you went to, as your father did, as Mayor Ray Flynn? I don't know. I'm thinking about political figures around the state. I always think of him when I think of Providence College.
Yeah. I mean, we grew up, going to church every Sunday morning at St. Teresa's, one of several parishes in Pittsfield that isn't there anymore, right? One of several churches.
Right.
When my kid brother Nick graduated from St. Joe's Central High School, the next year was the first year in 49 years there wasn't a Downing as a student at
Wow.
St. Joe's, right? We were dedicated income to the Catholic Church that way.
Yeah.
And we're sat in the same place. All were altar servers. And while my faith has come and gone over my life, the values I learned there, right? The values that my parents instilled in me, that our grandmother instilled in us. They're what I think of when I think of the best values of that church.
So let's switch a little to the here and now and this race. Yeah. And I'm just curious how you sort of look at this job of governor and what the elements are, because there's obviously the big, broad, vision and the political philosophy that you bring to it and to the issues that you deal with. But as this pandemic has made clear in a way that maybe nothing else has quite so strikingly, the first order of business is really just manage the pressing issues affecting the well-being of residents and the functioning of government. It's that managerial job that you need to tend to before you, or alongside, whatever the kind of grander ideas you have. How do you sort of see the job in terms of those, at least those two big buckets and two parts of it?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, Michael, that there's the sort of the vision bucket and the execution, right? The day-to-day bucket. One spot where I might push back a little bit, though, is that, those two are not, they're not silos, in that, I don't think anyone could have foreseen a pandemic on the scale and with the impact of COVID-19, right? But we knew that tough times would come, even if we were in, a boom back from the previous recession, right? We know there are these ups and downs. We know there are challenges, even if we can't look out into the future with 2020 vision and see what it will look like. And, for me, that's where our leadership has come up short, whether in the corner office or in the legislature, is taking the steps in those more stable times that will take the edge off the worst parts of the downturn. So I think to be a good governor, you not only have to have that vision, right? The broader vision, the broader goals, but you need to be able to execute not just in times of crisis, but in the day-to-day, to build trust and to take the steps that will make the sort of the ups and downs that much less peaky, right? To try to take the edge off. Like that's the role of state government, to avoid the worst of that, and especially for communities that have too long been, left to feel the brunt of environmental injustice, economic injustice, and racism, right? So I think a successful governor, a successful leader, is someone who has the ability to set the vision and then manage in the day-to-day, working towards that vision. Because if you just manage in the day-to-day, right, at some point you're chasing the day-to-day and you lose a feel for the broader goal and the broader set of principles and values you're trying to work towards.
So how would you, in that sort of lens, how would you size up Charlie Baker's performance as governor?
I think Charlie Baker is a good man and a dedicated public servant, right? He's someone who I disagree with on the issues. And I think he's someone who has had, has accumulated significant political capital, right? And I think the examples of him using that capital to address those big challenges, to address climate and economic and racial justice, are few and far between, right? I think it is easy for people running for office to Monday morning quarterback some of the decisions at the front end of the pandemic. I think it's important to have those debates. I think to a degree it's unfair because of just how earth-shattering and altering those moments were. And I think we need to remember that as we move forward here. I think coming up out of it, right, and I think that's the frustration with the vaccine rollout, right, is that this is the one we had the time for. This is the one that we should have learned some of the lessons from previous mistakes on previous websites and other rollouts on. So I think it's incomplete at this point, right? I'm not one to provide a grade one way or the other, but I think Governor Baker has missed the opportunity to use that political capital to address the big challenges that Massachusetts faces. And I think, we're weaker for it.
And even though, let's get to some of those bigger issues, but just as you say, and I think you're being extremely generous or maybe just fair to say, at the outset, it was so unprecedented and the decisions that had to be made quickly, was hard to know what was the right way to go. But be that as it may, are you saying now, this issue that we've known almost since the pandemic started almost a year ago, we immediately started hearing, right, they had sequenced the virus and the race was on for a vaccine. So we had almost a year, preparation to know that we were hoping there was going to be before too long a vaccine. Have they really given that? Is it pretty inexcusable, I guess, just how badly things have gone in terms of the website, in terms of kind of knowing what the distribution model was going to be, these mass sites versus now we're hearing from, municipal public health departments, they're upset that, vaccines they were going to distribute are being pulled back on it. It feels a little, frankly, chaotic and chaotic in a way that maybe it shouldn't be given the lead time we've had on this phase of things.
Yeah, it's beyond frustrating, and there aren't any excuses for where we land right now. Right before we began this discussion, I'm on a text thread with my brother and sister. Our mom's 70 years old. We're trying to get our mom an appointment. We've had the app crash on us a few times, like everyone has, trying to work our way through it. And again, we knew this one was coming. It's not enough to say, well, 2 million people came to the website on the day, so you just have to shrug your shoulders and say, hey, that's where we're going to land, right? It's not enough to say that we know that there are longstanding and understandable concerns in communities of color around vaccination because of a history of medical racism. And so that's why the numbers are bad. No, we need to go out there and proactively and intentionally partner with local organizations to address that on the front end. We had the time. We didn't use that time. And that is a mistake, and it's a mistake we're paying for dearly as we see vaccination rates in communities with the lowest rate of COVID going up, while vaccination rates in communities with the highest rates of COVID holding steady and persistently lower than they should be, right? So I think, yes, this is the frustrating part. It seems like we had a much more public and open process around how the economy was going to reopen in the summer than we did about how we were going to roll out the vaccine. Well, if you don't get the vaccine right, we're not going to get to reopen the economy the way that we want to, right? So that's the frustrating thing for me. It's where and when we've had processes that would actually allow us to be successful.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about, again, sort of stepping outside of the crisis we're in, sort of this broader vision and ways that you think the state could be, moving ahead much more aggressively in ways that we've kind of missed the boat or missed opportunities. And just talk a little about the clean energy efforts. That's something you had a lot to do with during your time in the legislature, and we haven't really gone into it, but when you left the legislature a few years ago, you left and started working for a clean energy firm. in the private sector. So we've got this, effort now to move toward carbon neutral energy plan. You think that the goal is not ambitious enough, and that we could be at 100% renewable, within the decade is the goal you've set? Or
I would say 100% electricity, 100% clean electricity by 2030, and then 100% clean energy by 2040. And
what would we have to do, practically speaking, that we're not doing? How would you get us on that track in a way that we're kind of lagging?
Yeah, so the first part, right, would have been, instead of vetoing the climate legislation at the end of last session, right, and relying on tired old arguments around costs without examining benefits of climate action, it would have been signing that legislation into law and then working right away to implement it, right? That is ambitious and significant legislation, but it also requires a great deal of work by the administrative agencies to develop the policies, the tools, the incentives to hit those goals. And, Senator Barrett and Representative Golden know this in the legislation they outlined. It's important work. We've got to do that and get on to the next steps. And that looks like everything from, encouraging use of electric vehicles, continued encouragement of solar and battery storage, continuing to try to deploy offshore wind where and when we can, and then redoubling our efforts on energy efficiency and conservation. All of that needs to be done, and it's important, and this is, I think, central to how I've tried to think about issues and continue to think about issues, Michael. We can't just think about climate as, all right, we're doing climate over here, and we're going to take, transportation and housing, we'll have those debates somewhere else. All of that work that we just talked about in climate that needs to get done is critically important. But if we're cutting funding for the MBTA and our other RTAs, if we're failing to invest more in the MBTA and the other RTAs, then we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. Like we aren't actually marshaling all of the resources of state government to take on this generational challenge, right? So I think there have been numerous examples where the Baker administration not only hasn't shown the urgency on climate change, but where they haven't shown the understanding of its interconnectedness to every other part of state government, right? And that's everything from making a commitment to increase funding for resiliency and environmental justice communities, to trying to change the way the utilities do business to make it easier to bring on more clean energy, and then trying to come up with incentives to help people make the transition away from heating oil, to do the home energy audits, to do all of the nitty-gritty work in buildings and in our transportation systems. We need to hit these goals. But you don't do it with half measures, and you don't do it listening to the same tired old arguments and debates that we've had for the last 20 years. Those are settled. We've got to focus on doing the work.
And so some of this work and some of the ambition that you would have for the state does involve more revenue and more spending. And so we know we've got this so-called millionaires tax sitting there as something that voters are going to probably be asked to weigh in on, which you support. Are there other ways you think we should be looking to bring in more revenue? What kind of measures would you support or push?
Yeah, so yes, we need to look for other ways, and we also shouldn't wait on the millionaires tax, right? Like, we don't know what the outcome of that will be. We do know that we need to make more investment in key areas, whether it's transportation, housing, universal childcare, right? Those type of investments are going to require the state to spend more money to make more investments, and you do that through comprehensive tax reform. You do that by having the goal of that comprehensive tax reform be that we ask more of the wealthiest in our communities, those who have benefited over the economic uptick of the last decade before COVID, and those that have even benefited during COVID.
That be like taxes on capital gains, or how would you look at that?
Yeah, sure. Whether it's capital gains, whether it's the income tax rate itself, all of those ought to be on the table, right? And we had a framework for this under Governor Patrick, where we were able to, in his proposal, it would have gone up on the income tax, down on the sales tax, lowered the overall effective tax rate. That's the type of broad thinking that we need to have. And I think you need to have it at the start of an administration and have that debate, because I know those debates are tough. I have the scar tissue from those debates over time. But it's important if we actually want to make these investments. And the example that I come back to, folks rightly celebrated the Student Opportunity Act, and thankfully, the work of Senator Chang Diaz and others was signed into law. But the frustrating thing there is that's phased in over 7 years. So a kid who's in middle school, right? By the time that's fully funded, by the time we have equitable funding for our schools, that kid is either in the workforce or in college, right? And why is that? Because we have refused to have this tough debate. We've refused to find a way to ask more of those who have benefited from economic growth and the communities that have benefited from economic growth. We've refused to ask more of them because it's a politically tough decision. I can't abide that. We're better than that.
Mm-hmm. And just we should wrap up. But lastly, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your trajectory. Literally, you're a Western Mass guy. You represented that area. You're from Pittsfield. But you now live with your family in East Boston, so you've gone from probably the most rural area of the state to one of its densest communities. What's that been like, and sort of what have you taken from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we love East Boston, right? It's the neighborhood that my dad's parents and their family first came to.
Is that right?
Yeah, we can take Malcolm and Eamon for a walk and point at the house that that their grandmother grew up in, the house their grandfather grew up in. The first two, if not three, of my dad's brothers and sisters were born in East Boston before they went out to Pittsfield.
So there's that old pioneer thing, go west, young man, but for you guys it just meant Western Mass. You didn't go to Oklahoma or the Prairie.
Yeah, stop short a little bit. The hills caught John Downing, right? So yeah, no, we've loved the experience. We love the neighborhood. We love the community. Before this, I loved riding the T with Mac every day to bring him to the East Boston Y. It's a vibrant community. It's a community that's in many ways radically different than Pittsfield and Western Mass, and in a lot of ways it's the same, right? A place that's had to struggle and fight to get equitable access to the resources it needs. And I think that's one of the things I hope to bring to the race, Michael, is I think too often in Massachusetts, because we've all had to fight so hard to get what our communities need, every region thinks someone else is benefiting from the status quo. And, I can make the case, and having seen it in my own life, that, it's that we're not doing nearly enough in communities like Pittsfield and East Boston. And there's a lot more common ground between and among those communities than there are that separates them. And I hope, that's the bet of this campaign in some ways. And I would hope one way or the other it's a bit of the outcome when all is said and done.
Well, it's been great talking, and we got a long way to go in this race for governor to 2022. I'm sure we'll hopefully have a chance to chat again, but I want to thank you, Ben Downing, for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I appreciate it. Stay safe and be well, everyone.
And you've been listening to another episode of the Codcast from Commonwealth Magazine. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.